The Moonlit Charge. Soldiers who fought under a mysterious, blood-red moon. Have you ever heard about soldiers encountering creatures they couldn't explain during the war? Well, what if I told you that the battles they fought were not the only things they had to survive? What if the true enemy was something far darker, something beyond human comprehension? It was a night like any other, war raging on, lives being lost. But for a small group of soldiers in a forgotten corner of the world, it would become a night they would never forget. A night when the very sky above them seemed to bleed. The blood-red moon hung above them, an ominous, unnatural glow casting long shadows over the battlefield. It was supposed to be a simple operation, in, out, and done. But as the moon climbed higher, something felt wrong. At first it was subtle, a whisper in the wind, a flash of movement at the corner of their eyes. Then came the sounds. Strange, unexplained. A distant scream, followed by an eerie silence. And then it began. Soldiers reported seeing things, shadows that moved like people but weren't, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Some swore they could hear the unmistakable sound of marching boots in the distance, though the ground was empty. No one could explain it. What was happening? Was it exhaustion? Was it the stress of battle? Or was there something else? Something far worse than the enemy they'd been fighting? But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part? The things that came out of the dark. It's hard to describe what happened next, and even harder to believe. Soldiers who were there can hardly talk about it. The few who survived have remained silent, their eyes haunted, their minds fractured. But for the first time, we're going to uncover what really happened that night. Together, we're going to dive deep into the mystery surrounding that battle, the soldiers involved, and the unexplainable horrors they faced. Some say they encountered spirits, others claim to have seen creatures, not of this world. And the few survivors? They're afraid to speak, afraid that saying too much will bring back what they encountered that night. But one survivor, one soldier, he holds the answers. He's been silent for years, his story locked away, buried deep. But today, we will uncover it. Today we will look back at that fateful night and try to understand why, after all this time, the nightmare refuses to die. So, what really happened that night under the blood-red moon? Was it just a trick of the mind, or is there something far darker at work? Let's find out together. But be warned, this story is not for the faint of heart. Keep watching to discover the shocking evidence and the chilling tale of the soldier who lived to tell the tale. And remember, if you are even a little intrigued by what you've heard so far, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Could this be true? Or is it just another ghost story of the battlefield? We'll dig deeper as we unravel the truth in the next moments. Stay tuned. They had been on the move for hours, through the thick forest that bordered the battlefield. It was supposed to be a quick patrol, nothing more. But that night, something was off. The soldiers, hardened by countless battles, began to feel an unease creeping over them, like an invisible weight pressing down on their shoulders. It started with the lights. At first it was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of their eyes. But soon, they couldn't ignore it. Strange lights in the distance. Faint at first, but growing brighter. They moved, not in the direction of the enemy, but in the direction of the forest. Odd, wasn't it? No one knew of any fire or flare in that area. Yet, the lights. They swirled in the darkness like some kind of signal, beckoning them closer. One of the soldiers, a young man named Thomas, was the first to mention it. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke, trying to sound casual, but failing. "Anyone else see that?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the flickering lights. "Maybe it's just a reflection," another soldier, Carl, suggested. He was always the practical one, the skeptic. But even he couldn't shake the discomfort that was starting to settle in his gut. "No," Thomas insisted. "It's something else. I swear it's like they're moving." They all paused. For a moment the wind stopped. Everything went silent, like the world was holding its breath. And then, without warning, a low rumble echoed through the ground beneath them. A sound they couldn't place. A sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The soldiers froze. Even Carl, ever the skeptic, felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The rumbling grew louder, closer, like something enormous was pushing its way through the earth, just beneath the surface. "Stay alert," the captain barked, his voice low and tense. He ordered the squad to spread out, scanning the trees and shadows. But even he couldn't hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. They walked in silence for a while, each soldier staring into the darkness, trying to spot any movement, any clue that would explain what they were feeling. The moon, now fully risen and blood-red, cast an eerie glow across the battlefield. The shadows seemed deeper, more twisted. Then came the sound. It was subtle at first, a whisper, barely audible, like the flutter of 1,000 wings. It was followed by a low murmur, the kind that echoed through the trees, sending chills down their spines. "I hear it. Do you hear that?" Thomas asked again, his voice almost cracking with fear. "I don't hear anything," Carl replied, but even his words were shaky now. The sounds became clearer, sharper. The trees seemed to creak and groan, like they were alive, like they were trying to warn them. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, moving in and out of the shadows. Too tall, too thin to be human. It was quick, too quick, and then it vanished just as fast as it had appeared. "Did you see that?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice barely a whisper. No one replied. They couldn't. They were too busy scanning the trees, hearts racing, adrenaline surging. Then another figure appeared, followed by a third. These figures didn't move like men. They glided, floating above the ground as if the rules of physics didn't apply to them. The soldiers looked at each other in stunned silence. What in the world was happening? Were these just hallucinations? Were they all just seeing things? But they couldn't deny what they saw. Figures that shouldn't exist, figures that moved without sound, figures that were watching them. As the night wore on, the figures grew bolder. One by one, they circled the soldiers, staying just outside the light of their flashlights, just beyond the reach of their vision. They would appear in one spot, then disappear, only to reappear in another place moments later. It was like they were playing a twisted game, only the soldiers weren't laughing. And the worst part? No one could explain it. "Stay close, don't break ranks," the captain ordered, his voice trembling. He was a seasoned soldier, one who had seen it all, but tonight even he didn't have an answer. A flash of movement caught the captain's eye. He turned just in time to see something that would haunt him forever. A figure, tall and pale, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. The figure tilted its head, watching him with an eerie, predatory gaze. And then, just like that, it was gone. The soldiers could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. The red moon above them burned brighter, casting an unnatural light over the battlefield. It felt like they were no longer part of the world they knew. Like they had stepped into a nightmare, a place where logic and reason didn't exist. "We need to leave." "Now," the captain said, his voice now sharp with urgency. But even as he said the words, he knew it was too late. They turned to leave, only to find themselves blocked by a wall of thick fog, thick as smoke, swirling and shifting around them. The air grew cold, biting, unnaturally so. It was as if the fog itself had a life of its own. The figures moved again, closer now, closer than before. "Run!" the captain shouted, and they did. But where would they go? The fog twisted around them, and the figures, they were everywhere. They were closing in. And just as they were about to make their escape, something even stranger happened. The ground began to shake, not like a typical tremor. This was something different, something deliberate, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. The soldiers stumbled, struggling, to keep their footing as the shaking intensified. The figures moved faster, becoming more solid, more real. They weren't hallucinations. They weren't tricks of the mind. No, these things were real, and they were hunting them. Was this the price they had to pay for war? Were the souls of the fallen reaching out to them from beyond the grave? Or was something else entirely at work, something even older, even darker than they could imagine? The soldiers didn't know. They couldn't understand. They only knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, they couldn't escape it. It said that the truth always finds its way to the surface. But what if the truth is something you're not prepared to face? What if, after everything you've seen, heard, and lived through, the truth is too monstrous to accept? For years, the survivors of that night remained silent. They couldn't speak about what they experienced. No one could. The memories were too terrifying, too confusing. But then, one soldier decided it was time to tell his story. One soldier chose to break the silence. His name was David, and he was the last man standing. David had always been a quiet man, reserved, almost introverted. He wasn't the kind to stand out in a crowd. But when he began to speak of that night, something changed. His voice trembled, but there was a fire in his eyes, one that hadn't been there before. "I've carried this burden for years," he began, his words shaky, his eyes unfocused. "I've never spoken about it, not to anyone. I couldn't, I wouldn't. But after all this time, I think it's time the world knew what happened." David was the only one to make it out. He'd been part of a unit sent into the dense forest to patrol an area that was reported to be strategic. It was supposed to be just another mission, another job to tick off. But that night, when the moon turned red, everything changed. He could still hear the crackling of the radio, still remember the words spoken by the commander. "Stay alert. This area is dangerous. We've received reports of unusual activity. Keep your eyes open." At first, there was nothing. The usual night sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of distant animals, made it feel like just another night in the field. But then, as the hours dragged on, David began to notice something strange. He'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the trees, a shadow darting too quickly to be a person. But when he would focus, nothing was there. It wasn't until the moon began to rise that things started to feel wrong. The air grew thick, heavy. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. David's squad wasn't used to fear. They had been trained to handle everything from bullets to bombs. But this was different. They were all on edge, their senses heightened, each of them whispering nervously. The sound of a twig snapping, the sight of an odd shadow against the trees made their hearts race. It was as if they were being watched. Then, the first strange occurrence happened. At first, it was a light, a soft glow off to the side, a strange, pulsating red light that seemed to flicker with a life of its own. David was the closest to it, and he could feel its warmth on his skin, even though it didn't seem to come from anything. There were no fires, no torches, But that light, it burned like a fire in his soul, filling him with an intense dread. He had no words for what happened next. He couldn't explain it. He still couldn't, not fully. But the figures that appeared, they weren't human. No, they were something else, something far older, far darker. They moved like shadows, shifting from one place to another, so fast it made David dizzy. They seemed to be made of darkness itself, yet their outlines were sharp, almost defined. Some wore armor, others robes, and their eyes, those eyes, glowed with an otherworldly light, not like anything David had ever seen before. David remembered the first time one of them spoke to him. The voice was soft, almost musical, like a whisper carried by the wind. "Why do you run, soldier?" it had asked. David froze, his rifle in his hands, his body tense. He had no answer. The words didn't make sense. He wanted to shoot. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't move. He never got a chance to respond. A shot rang out from another soldier, a desperate, trembling shot that missed its target by yards. The figure simply vanished, like smoke. But the damage was done. From that moment on, it was chaos. The soldiers began to panic, firing at shadows, shouting at each other in confusion. But no one seemed to know where to aim. The figures weren't human. They couldn't be shot. They weren't part of the world anymore. The soldiers were out of their depth, caught in something they couldn't fight, couldn't understand. David saw his comrades fall, one by one. Some were taken by the shadows, disappearing without a trace. Others seemed to collapse under an invisible weight, screaming as though the life was being sucked from them. But David, by some miracle, survived. He didn't know how. He couldn't explain it. All he knew was that he ran, just ran, deeper into the forest, away from the horrors that seemed to be closing in around him. He didn't stop running until he found a small cave, hidden from sight. There he huddled, shaking, waiting for the darkness to pass. But it never did. The figures kept coming, circling, never leaving. They whispered his name, calling him to the depths of the forest, to where the darkness was thickest. The moon, red and unnatural, never seemed to set, always hanging low in the sky, as if it was watching. David couldn't remember when he finally lost consciousness. But when he woke, hours, maybe days, later, the battlefield was empty. The fog had lifted, the shadows had disappeared, but the damage was done. And David knew that something far worse than war had just claimed the lives of his friends. Now, years later, he sits before us, telling his story for the first time. And though his voice wavers, there's a conviction in his words. He's not just reliving the horrors of that night. He's warning us that there's something still out there, something that's been waiting, perhaps for centuries, to rise again. David's story is far from over, but as he looks into the camera, you can see it, the fear still in his eyes. The same fear he felt that night under the blood-red moon. "Don't make the mistake we did," he says quietly. "You can't outrun it, and you can't fight it." David's story, chilling as it was, didn't answer all the questions. In fact, it opened up even more. What were these entities? Where did they come from? And why had they chosen that night, that particular group of soldiers, to make their presence known? These weren't just simple ghostly apparitions or hallucinations brought on by the stress of war. No, this was something far more dangerous, far more profound. As time passed, the survivors, or what was left of them, began to avoid speaking about that night. But rumors began to circulate. Soldiers who had served in the area began reporting strange occurrences. Even after they left the forest, the memories wouldn't fade. They couldn't escape the sensation that something was following them, something just out of sight, just beyond their reach. They would hear whispers in the dark, see shadowy figures out of the corner of their eyes. It was as if the war had never ended, as if the red moon had followed them home. Then there were the sounds. It started with a faint crackling in the air, like static on a broken radio. Soldiers thought it was just the after effects of battle. But it didn't go away. It followed them. Sometimes it sounded like distant voices, just barely audible, like someone speaking in a language they didn't understand. Other times, it was the unmistakable sound of marching, growing louder and louder until it seemed to be surrounding them. One evening, a group of soldiers stationed near a remote outpost began to hear it. The crackling, the distant shuffling of boots. At first, they dismissed it as the wind playing tricks or the distant echo of battle. But then, they noticed something that made their blood run cold. A single soldier, no more than a young private, was out on patrol when he saw it. In the distance, through the mist and the trees, he saw shapes moving. Figures. Men, but not men. Their forms were dark, their outlines blurred as if they were made of smoke or shadows that had yet to fully materialize. The private froze, heart pounding. He raised his rifle, aiming at the shapes, but as he did, they stopped moving. For a moment there was nothing. Then, one of the figures turned its head, slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with him. The private couldn't move. He felt the air grow colder, thicker, like something was pressing down on him. His breath came in ragged gasps. "Private, what the hell are you looking at?" came a voice behind him. The sergeant approached, his flashlight sweeping across the dark landscape. But when the beam landed where the private was pointing, there was nothing there. The figures had vanished. The private swore he saw them. He could still feel their presence, the coldness, the weight of their gaze. But the sergeant didn't believe him. "Get it together, soldier. You're seeing things. It's just the fog, or maybe some animals. Go back to your post." The private tried to shake it off. He tried to pretend he was imagining things. But deep down, he knew what he had seen. And from that moment on, the whispers grew louder. The shadows seemed to follow them. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And the static in the air only grew stronger, more oppressive. The next night, the events took a turn for the worse. A new recruit named James had been stationed alone in a small shack on the edge of the outpost. It was his first night, and he was on edge. He had heard the rumors, the strange occurrences, the disappearing soldiers, the sightings of figures that weren't quite human. But he hadn't believed it. Not until that night. He sat in the small room, eyes darting nervously as the wind howled outside. The air was thick with tension, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, it happened. A loud bang echoed through the shack, followed by an eerie scraping noise, like nails on metal. James stood up, his heart racing. He grabbed his flashlight and crept toward the door. His hand trembled as he twisted the knob, the door creaking open to reveal the forest outside. He stepped out, scanning the darkness with his light. And then, he saw it. A figure, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadows, standing at the edge of the trees. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but James could feel its presence. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. James stumbled back, breath shallow, eyes wide with fear. He turned to run, but as he did, the ground beneath his feet seemed to give way. His vision blurred, and for a moment everything seemed to spin around him. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder, cold like the grave. He looked back, but there was nothing there. He bolted. He didn't stop running until he reached the main camp, his heart pounding in his chest, his legs trembling with exhaustion. When he told the others, they didn't believe him either. They thought it was just another case of nerves. But deep down, they all knew. The tension had become unbearable. It was like something, or someone, was watching them from the trees. And then, the strangest thing of all happened. The following day, they found something on the edge of the outpost. It was small, almost insignificant. A stone, just a regular stone, sitting in the middle of the path. But when they examined it, they saw something that made their blood run cold. There were markings on it, symbols, strange, ancient symbols that none of them could decipher. They couldn't explain it. They couldn't understand what it meant. But one thing was certain. Whatever was happening, whatever they were facing, it was no accident. This was deliberate. And it wasn't just in their minds. It was real. The soldiers tried to go about their business. They tried to act normal. But how could they? With every passing day, the shadows grew longer, the whispers louder. They couldn't escape it. And deep down, they knew something was coming. Something darker than they could imagine. Whatever was behind these strange occurrences wasn't just haunting them, it was hunting them. Days bled into nights, and the soldiers became increasingly disoriented, their minds plagued by the strange occurrences that seemed to follow them at every turn. But as much as they feared the unknown forces lurking in the shadows, they were still bound to the battlefield, their orders, and the war that refused to end. Yet, deep down, they all felt it, the pull of something greater, something older than anything they had encountered before. It was during one of these days, as the soldiers huddled together in the main barracks, that the conversation turned to their past. The war, the haunting figures, the whispers, they couldn't outrun them. And so the soldiers began sharing their experiences, their theories, and their suspicions. But one man, Lieutenant Harris, had been silent through it all. He was a seasoned officer, a man who had fought in countless battles, and one of the few who had witnessed the strange phenomenon firsthand. He had heard the whispers, he had seen the shadows, but he hadn't said a word. Not until that night. It started with a question from Carl, the skeptic of the group. He had heard the rumors, had seen the signs, and his disbelief had slowly given way to dread. But there was one thing he couldn't reconcile: the strange markings found on the stone outside the outpost. "What do you think it means, Lieutenant?" Carl asked, his voice low and cautious. Is this a curse? Some kind of omen?" The lieutenant's gaze darkened, his eyes growing distant. He took a slow breath, as though the weight of the question was pressing down on him, forcing him to confront memories he had long buried. Then, his voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "I've seen that symbol before," he said, his words carrying a weight that chilled the room. "It's not just some random marking, it's ancient. I should have known better. I should have spoken up." The soldiers leaned forward, hanging on every word. They had never seen Harris like this before. The lieutenant, who had always been in control, now seemed shaken. "I encountered that symbol long before I came here," Harris continued, his voice trembling. "Back when I was stationed in the Middle East, there were whispers, rumors about an old military camp, one that was abandoned long ago. The locals called it the Cursed Outpost. I never believed in such things. I thought it was just superstition, just the ramblings of people who didn't understand war. But when I saw that symbol again..." His voice faltered, and he swallowed hard. It all clicked. He paused, as if weighing whether or not to continue. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the room thickening with each passing second. "The truth is," he finally said, his eyes haunted, "this war isn't just about territory, power, or survival. There's something far darker at play, something ancient, something tied to this land. Those figures, the ones you saw, they're not just ghosts, they're not the spirits of the dead. They are part of something older than us. And they have been waiting. David, who had been listening intently, narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Waiting for what? Harris's gaze shifted to the ground, as though he couldn't bear to meet their eyes. Waiting for the blood to spill, for the war to awaken them. You see, there's a history here, one that's been buried for centuries. The room fell silent, each soldier processing Harris's words. The air was thick with unease, and the weight of the lieutenant's confession hung heavy over them. For the first time, they realized that they were not just caught in the grip of war. They were entangled in something far more ancient, more sinister. Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair, then spoke again. Years ago, before this camp was established, this land was the site of an ancient battlefield. It's said that the soldiers who fought here, they were cursed. Their spirits were bound to the earth, never allowed to rest. The locals used to tell stories about the Red Moon, a night when the spirits of the fallen would rise, fueled by the bloodshed that had been spilled. The blood-red moon, murmured Carl, his voice filled with disbelief. Yes, Harris whispered. It was said that every century, when the conditions were right, when the bloodshed reached its peak, the spirits would return, and they would demand the blood of the living to satisfy their thirst for vengeance. David's heart pounded in his chest. So, the figures we saw, the ones stalking us in the forest, they were the spirits of those fallen soldiers. Harris nodded grimly. But not just any spirits. These weren't the restless souls of ordinary men. These were soldiers who had fought and died in battles long before this war. They were cursed to return, again and again, until their vengeance was fulfilled. And now that we're here, fighting on this land, we've unknowingly awakened them. They're not just haunting us, they're hunting us. The soldiers sat in stunned silence. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it only deepened the mystery. What had they gotten themselves into? They had thought they were fighting for survival, for their country. But now it seemed they were fighting something far older, something that had no regard for national borders, no interest in political gain. This was a fight for something far more ancient. Vengeance. We can't keep running, David said, his voice low, filled with determination. We need to find out more about this curse. We need to stop it or we'll all be dead by morning. Harris looked at him, his expression grim. It's not that simple, David. You don't just stop something like this. The curse has been in place for centuries. The only way to break it is to find the source, to uncover the truth behind the Red Moon, and to stop the bloodshed from continuing. And how do we do that? Carl asked, his voice edged with skepticism. Harris glanced up, his eyes dark and filled with something akin to regret. There's a way, but it's not going to be easy. The only way to break the curse is to uncover the truth of the battle that took place here all those years ago, to find the soldiers who fought, the ones who were part of the bloodshed, and to offer them peace. Peace? David repeated. How do we do that? How do we offer peace to something that isn't human? Harris shook his head. I don't know, but it's the only chance we have. If we don't find a way to stop them, they'll keep coming, and soon none of us will make it out of here alive. The room fell into a heavy silence. The soldiers, once determined to survive the war, now found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't understand, an enemy that was far beyond anything they had ever fought. But one thing was certain. They had to stop the bloodshed. They had to uncover the hidden mysteries that tied them to the cursed land before it was too late. The weight of Harris's revelation hung over them, thick and suffocating. For the first time, the soldiers realized that they were no longer fighting an enemy they could see, an enemy they could face with guns and grenades. No, they were fighting something far older, more insidious. They weren't just in a battle against human forces. They were in a fight for their very souls. But the more they thought about the curse, the more they felt it closing in around them. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves outside the barracks, and the air seemed to grow colder. It was as if the forest itself was watching them, waiting. And then, in the distance, there was a sound, a low, growling hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a noise that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to the sounds of war, gunfire, explosions, the cries of the wounded. But this was different. This was unnatural. "What the hell is that?" Carl muttered, his voice barely audible, his eyes darting nervously toward the edge of the camp. "I don't know," Harris replied, his face taut with worry. "But we need to stay alert. Whatever it is, it's not part of the war." David, ever the pragmatic one, rose to his feet, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "I'll go check it out," he said, his voice calm despite the fear gnawing at him. He couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind, that same sense of being watched. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for something he couldn't explain to take him by surprise. The others nodded in agreement, too fearful to argue. Carl and Harris stood in the doorway, watching as David stepped into the dense fog outside the barracks. His boots crunched softly on the gravel path as he made his way toward the source of the strange noise, the eerie stillness of the night pressing in around him. The deeper David went into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind, their leaves whispering secrets in a language he didn't understand. The moon above, once blood-red, now seemed to flicker in and out of view, as if it were being obscured by a veil that only David could sense. Suddenly there was a movement ahead. Quick, too quick. David froze, his heart racing. His flashlight beam flickered as he swung it toward the source of the motion. Nothing. Just shadows, stretching and swaying with the wind. David's breath hitched. He could feel something. It wasn't just the usual feeling of being alone in the woods at night. This was something else. Something worse. A presence, as if the very air around him had taken on a life of its own. He took a slow step forward, trying to steady his shaking hands. The sound was there again. Closer now. Closer than before. It wasn't growling. It was whispering. Low and guttural, like the voice of someone trying to speak from the grave. And then he saw it. A figure. Tall, pale, its features obscured by the shadows. The thing seemed to glide, not walk, its body moving with an unnatural fluidity, as though it were made of the very darkness around it. David's breath caught in his throat. His pulse hammered in his ears. The figure stopped, its head turning slowly toward him. David couldn't see its face, but he could feel its eyes. Cold, hollow, empty, boring into him. His grip on his rifle tightened, but he knew it wouldn't do him any good. What was he supposed to do? Shoot it? Could bullets even harm it? The figure took a step forward, and David could feel the ground beneath his feet shift, as if the earth itself were alive. His stomach churned, and he instinctively took a step back, only to find himself tripping over something unseen, a root, a stone, the ground itself. He couldn't tell. He stumbled, but managed to right himself, his heart racing in his chest. But when he looked up, the figure was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. David didn't hesitate. He turned and bolted back toward the camp, fear gripping him with every step. His heart pounded in his ears, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He couldn't explain it. He didn't understand it. But whatever it was real. By the time he returned to the barracks, the other soldiers were waiting anxiously. The fog around them seemed thicker now, more suffocating. David's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, and the others could see the terror in his gaze. "What did you see?" Carl asked, his voice a mix of concern and disbelief. David didn't answer at first. He couldn't. How could he? He could barely form the words to describe what had just happened. "David," Harris pressed, "what did you see out there?" David swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "I saw something," he muttered, his voice hoarse. It wasn't human. It was like it was made of shadows, but it was real. It was standing right in front of me, watching me." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard the stories, the rumors about the cursed land, the strange occurrences. But hearing it from David, hearing the fear in his voice, it made it real. "What do you think it was?" Carl asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David shook his head. "I don't know. I don't know what it was, but whatever it is, it's not going to stop. We're not just dealing with ghosts or spirits. We're dealing with something that's beyond us." Suddenly, the air seemed to crackle with tension. The shadows around them felt darker, the fog thicker. It was as if the very land itself was closing in, pushing them toward something they weren't prepared for. And then, as if in response to their fears, the ground beneath their feet trembled, ever so slightly, but enough to make them freeze in place. The low rumble came again, the sound growing louder, as though something huge and unseen was moving beneath them. The soldiers stood still, staring at each other. There was no sound now, except for their own breathing and the distant rumble. And then, something else, something far worse. From the shadows, something began to emerge. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a figure, no more than one, began to take shape. The soldiers had no words, only terror. They were surrounded. The tension in the camp was unbearable. The whispers, the shadows, the ever-present feeling of being hunted. It was like they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The figures they had seen in the woods weren't the hallucinations of battle fatigue or stress. They were real. They were something. Something they couldn't understand. Something far beyond the reach of their training and experience. David, Carl, Harris, and the others huddled together in the dimly lit barracks, their faces pale, their minds reeling from the events of the past few days. What was happening? What had they stumbled into? As if in response to their fear, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the camp again. Closer this time. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the vibrations creeping up their legs like an invisible force pressing down on them. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't artillery. It was something different. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. The air was thick with unease, the atmosphere heavier than it had ever been. No one spoke for a long moment, each of them consumed by their thoughts. And then Carl spoke up, his voice shaky but filled with determination. "We need to figure out what's going on. We can't just sit here and wait to be picked off one by one. There has to be an explanation." David nodded, his jaw clenched. "We've seen too much. It's not just some curse or some ghost story. Something's causing all of this. We need to find out what it is before it destroys us all." "We've been searching for days," Harris said, his voice low, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as the others. "But all we've found are strange markings, scattered clues. Nothing concrete, nothing that gives us a real answer." "You mean these?" Carl's voice was sharp as he pulled out a small, weathered piece of paper from his pocket. The ink was smudged and faded, but the symbols on it were still clear. Strange, intricate patterns that none of them could decipher. David took the paper from Carl and held it up to the dim light, studying it intently. The symbols were familiar, like the ones they had found on the stone outside the camp. But there was something more in the way they were arranged. A pattern. A map, perhaps. "Where did you find this?" David asked. Carl shrugged. "I found it near the edge of the camp, under a pile of old leaves. It was like it was hidden, tucked away, as if someone didn't want it found." Harris leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "It looks like the symbols on the stone. But this feels different, like it's trying to tell us something important." David felt a chill run down his spine. "But what? What could it possibly mean?" The soldiers fell silent again, the only sound in the room the distant hum of the air as the camp seemed to grow even darker, the shadows longer. "We've been chasing ghosts, looking for something that makes sense, something that fits into the framework of what we know," Harris said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But what if we're not meant to understand it? What if this thing, whatever it is beyond our comprehension? What if the symbols are just a way of showing us that we don't know anything? That we're just pawns in a game we can't possibly understand?" Carl looked skeptical. "You think we're just supposed to sit here and wait for whatever this is to kill us?" "No," Harris said firmly. "I'm saying we need to start thinking differently. We need to stop looking for logical explanations. What if this curse isn't something we can explain? What if it's not bound by the rules of time, space, or science?" David was about to reply when another tremor shook the ground beneath them, this one stronger than the previous. The air grew colder still, and a strange, metallic taste filled their mouths, as if the very atmosphere had changed. "What the hell was that?" Carl asked, his eyes wide with fear. "It's them," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're here." They rushed outside, their rifles raised, scanning the darkness. The camp had grown eerily still, the usual sounds of the forest. Birds, rustling leaves, distant animals had all fallen silent. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, and a shadow seemed to flicker at the edge of the camp. It was there, but not there, a figure, tall and thin, its outline barely visible, moving in and out of the darkness. It was watching them. The soldiers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had faced enemy soldiers, artillery fire, and ambushes. But this was something different. This was beyond anything they had ever faced. Carl was the first to break the silence. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. David's heart raced, but his mind was clear. "We do what we've been trained to do," he said, his voice firm. "We fight." But as they began to move forward, the shadows shifted, and the air thickened. The metallic taste became stronger, the static crackling in the air almost deafening. Something was wrong. Something was interfering with their senses, warping their reality. David glanced back at the others. "Stay together. No matter what happens, stay together." And then it happened. The shadows in the distance grew larger, more defined. Figures began to materialize from the mist, tall and ethereal, their movements jerky and unnatural. There were more of them now, dozens, appearing from all sides, their faces hidden in the shadows. Their eyes glowed with a faint, otherworldly light, and they moved toward the soldiers, slow and deliberate, like they were searching for something. David's pulse hammered in his chest. This was no longer just a ghost story. This was real. This was happening. "Get ready," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Aim for the head." But just as he raised his rifle, a figure stepped forward, one of the shadowy beings who had been lurking at the edge of the camp. This one was different, taller, more solid. It seemed to exude a presence, a power that made the ground beneath their feet tremble. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, a rasping whisper that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "You cannot stop what has already begun." The words sent a chill down David's spine. The figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "This is not your war, soldier," the figure continued, its voice echoing in David's mind. "This is something older, something beyond your understanding, and now you are part of it." David lowered his rifle, his hand trembling. What was this? Was it a man, a spirit, a demon? What was he facing? The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming. The soldiers backed away, the sense of dread suffocating them. "You cannot fight what you cannot see," the figure whispered, before fading into the shadows. David's heart raced. The creature's words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Was it true? Were they truly trapped in something they couldn't escape? Was there any way to stop the curse before it consumed them all? The night stretched on in an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind that stirred the trees. The soldiers huddled together in the barracks, their minds racing with the chilling words of the shadowy figure. "You cannot stop what has already begun." The words repeated in David's mind like a haunting refrain, echoing in his ears, making it impossible to shake the sense of impending doom. But there was no time to linger on fear. They had to act. They couldn't just sit back and wait for whatever this was to take them. They needed answers, and they needed them now. David stood up, his jaw set in determination. "We can't keep guessing about what's happening. We need to find out everything we can about this place, about the curse. Whatever's going on, we need to know why it's happening, and more importantly, how to stop it." Carl and Harris exchanged glances before nodding. "Agreed," Harris said, his voice still filled with uncertainty but tinged with resolve. "But where do we start? We've been digging around for days, and we haven't found much of anything that makes sense." David turned to the stack of old maps they had found in the archives earlier, the ones that were nearly falling apart from age. They had been buried beneath years of dust and neglect, untouched for what seemed like decades. But something told him that these maps, these old documents, held the key. They were their only hope now. "We start with the land," David said. "The land holds the answers. This curse, these spirits, they didn't just appear out of nowhere. Something happened here, something that triggered this." Carl frowned. "What do you mean, the land?" "Think about it," David said, pacing as he spoke. "The battle, the red moon, all these things are tied to this place. There must be something in the history of this land that we don't know about. Something that caused all this to start." He grabbed one of the older maps, smoothing it out on the table. His finger traced the lines of ancient roads, old battlefields, and forgotten settlements. This place was a battlefield before the war. There was a massacre here, an event so brutal it left a scar on the land. This is where the curse began. Harris leaned in, squinting at the map. "We know this place was used for military operations before we arrived, but you're saying there's something older? Something that predates even the wars we've fought in?" David nodded, his finger moving to a specific spot on the map, a location deep in the heart of the forest, far away from the main camp. "There's a place here, right in the center of the battlefield. It's marked as an old burial site. It's never been excavated, and no one ever talks about it. But this is where the battle took place, the one that supposedly triggered the curse." Carl's eyes widened. "You're saying that the blood spilled here?" "Exactly," David interrupted. "It's not just a coincidence. Whatever happened here, Whatever blood was spilled, it wasn't just a war. It was something much darker. The souls of those soldiers, the ones who died in that battle, they never left. They were bound to this place, and now their thirst for vengeance has come back. Harris stood up, his hands trembling. You think that burial site is where it all started? That's where we need to go? David turned, looking directly at him. We don't have a choice. We need to see it for ourselves. If we can find out what happened there, maybe we can break the curse. Maybe we can finally stop whatever is haunting us. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They knew the risks. They knew that venturing deeper into the cursed land meant facing whatever dark force was at work. But they also knew they had no other choice. The next morning they set out, armed with rifles, maps, and flashlights, ready to explore the burial site. The sun was weak through the mist, the sky a dull gray. The forest around them seemed to press in, silent and oppressive. It was a different kind of quiet, unnatural, like the trees were watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the tension grew. Every rustle in the underbrush made their muscles tense. Every crack of a branch underfoot made them jump. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was the feeling that something was watching them, that something was waiting for them to reach the very heart of the forest. After what felt like hours of trudging through thick foliage, they finally arrived at the burial site. It was nothing like they had expected. The ground was uneven, with jagged rocks protruding from the earth, as if the land itself had been warped by the violence of the past. There were no markers, no headstones, just a vast, barren patch of land where the earth seemed to have been disturbed, as though someone or something had been digging at it for centuries. Is this it? Carl asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, scanning the area. There was something about the place that felt wrong, something unsettling. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the wind didn't stir the trees here. It was as if the land itself had frozen in time. This is where it all started, David said, his voice low. They split up, carefully searching the area for any clues. Harris moved toward a patch of disturbed soil, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the ground. Carl searched the perimeter, his eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. David, however, focused on the center of the site. There, half buried beneath the earth, he spotted something. A stone. It wasn't like the others they had found. This one was much larger, and it seemed to radiate an unnatural energy. It was covered in moss and dirt, but something about it made David's heart race. He knelt down, brushing the dirt away, revealing ancient markings carved into the stone. The symbols were familiar, strange, cryptic patterns, just like the ones they had seen before. David's fingers traced the symbols. They were cold to the touch, colder than anything he had ever felt. His mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The symbols, they're the key, David muttered, his voice trembling. They're what's holding the curse here. Harris and Carl joined him, looking at the stone in awe. What is this? Carl asked. What does it mean? David stood up, his mind racing. This stone, it's not just a marker, it's a seal. It's what's been holding the spirits, the curse, in place all these years, but it's weakening. The blood from the battles we've fought, it's been feeding it, and now it's breaking free. Suddenly the ground beneath their feet trembled again, stronger this time. The rumbling grew louder and a low, guttural growl filled the air, as if something beneath the earth was waking. We need to go, Harris shouted, panic in his voice. But David didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the stone, the symbols glowing faintly beneath his touch. He knew what needed to be done. He had to break the seal. "We have to destroy this stone," he said, his voice firm. "It's the only way to stop this." Before the others could protest, he raised his rifle and fired. The shot struck the stone, sending a violent shockwave through the ground. The rumbling intensified, and the air grew thick with energy. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the earth began to crack open, the ground splitting wide beneath their feet. From the depths of the earth, something began to rise. Something ancient, something powerful. The curse was waking, and they were running out of time. The ground beneath their feet continued to tremble violently, the cracks in the earth widening as though the land itself were being torn apart. A low, unearthly growl reverberated from deep within the earth, vibrating through their bones. The very air around them seemed to hum, charged with a malevolent energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. David, Carl, and Harris backed away from the stone, their eyes wide with fear as the rumbling intensified. The force of the tremors sent them stumbling, but there was no escape. The earth around them split further, and from within the widening fissures something began to rise, a shadow, blacker than the night, taking shape from the darkness. David's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just an earthquake. This wasn't some natural phenomenon. This was something far worse. The figure that emerged from the earth was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was massive, towering over them with a presence so terrifying that even the air seemed to recoil in fear. Its form was fluid, shifting like a living shadow, with tendrils of darkness curling around its body. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed with an intense, unnatural red light, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding landscape. The soldiers froze, rooted to the spot in sheer terror. They had faced danger before, fought in battles that would break the spirits of lesser men. But this was beyond their understanding. What is that?" Carl whispered, his voice shaking. David could hardly bring himself to answer. "I don't know, but it's what we've been running from." The creature, if it could be called that, slowly rose from the earth, its form becoming more solid with each passing second. It moved in unnatural jerks, its body flickering like a mirage, as if it didn't belong in the world they knew. Its presence was suffocating, as if the air itself thickened around them, making it harder to breathe. Then, it spoke. The voice that emanated from the creature wasn't a voice at all, at least not in the way they understood it. It was a low, guttural rumble, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth, from the darkest corners of existence. It was a voice that filled their minds, bypassing their ears, resonating directly in their skulls. "You have awakened me," the creature intoned, its voice reverberating in the very marrow of their bones. "You have freed me from the depths, and now you will suffer the consequences." David's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a curse they had been battling. This thing, this entity, was ancient. It was older than anything they could fathom, an unfathomable force bound beneath the earth, awakened by the bloodshed of war. The massacre that had taken place here, the lives lost in that brutal battle, they had fed it, nurtured it, allowed it to grow stronger with every drop of blood spilled on this cursed ground. The creature's eyes locked onto them, and David felt an overwhelming sense of dread flood his chest. This wasn't just some mindless force. It was intelligent, aware of their presence, and it had been waiting for this moment. The tendrils of darkness that seemed to form its body began to move, curling and stretching as if reaching for something. David could feel the air grow colder, the oppressive energy pressing down on them, squeezing the life from their lungs. It was like the creature was drawing strength from the very land beneath them, feeding off the fear, the terror it had awakened. Suddenly, with a horrific, guttural screech, the creature lunged forward, its tendrils reaching out with inhuman speed. David barely had time to react. He raised his rifle, firing at the advancing shadow. The bullets tore through the air, striking the creature, but the shot seemed to have no effect. The creature only seemed to grow more furious. "What the hell?" Carl shouted, backing away, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his weapon. Harris fired off a few rounds, but they were just as useless. The creature barely flinched. It was as if their bullets were nothing more than flies buzzing around its head. This isn't possible," Harris yelled, his voice breaking. David, still reeling from the horror of the encounter, knew that no matter how many rounds they fired, it wouldn't make a difference. They were dealing with something beyond their understanding. No gun, no weapon could hurt it. "Run!" David screamed, his voice desperate. "We need to get out of here." But the creature's tendrils were faster. One lashed out, coiling around Harris's leg before he could react. The soldier screamed in pain as the tendril tightened, pulling him toward the darkness that swirled around the creature's form. "Harris!" Carl screamed, rushing forward to help. But before he could reach him, another tendril lashed out, striking him in the chest. Carl was flung back, crashing into a tree with a sickening thud. David's heart raced as he watched his comrades being dragged toward the creature. He couldn't help them. Not like this. Not with weapons that couldn't even touch it. "No!" David shouted, his voice breaking as he turned and ran. The forest blurred around him as he sprinted away, his mind focused only on survival. Behind him, he could hear the creature's laughter, low, cruel, and mocking. It echoed through the woods, a sound that chilled him to the core. It was like the creature was enjoying their terror, savoring their hopelessness. David ran faster, his lungs burning, his legs threatening to give out, but he couldn't stop. He had to escape. He had to survive. The sounds of the creature's pursuit were fading now, but David didn't slow down. He kept running, not daring to look back. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in on him, the trees leaning closer, the shadows deeper. It felt like the very land itself was trying to pull him down into the earth, to bury him with the other souls who had been trapped here. He didn't stop running until he reached the camp, breathless and covered in sweat. He stumbled into the barracks, slamming the door behind him. Carl and Harris were gone. The terror that had gripped David's heart hadn't relented. It never would. What they had witnessed out there was no longer a curse. It was a living nightmare, an ancient, insatiable force that had been awakened by their actions. They had no idea how to fight it, no idea how to survive. But one thing was certain. The creature had made its intentions clear. The soldiers were not meant to survive. They were meant to be its next sacrifice. David's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, frantic bursts. The barracks felt like a tomb, its walls closing in on him as he paced back and forth, trying to make sense of the nightmare that had just unfolded. His hands trembled as he gripped his rifle, though he knew it was useless. Nothing could stop that thing. Nothing could stop the ancient evil they had awakened. Carl and Harris were gone. Just like that. The creature had taken them in the blink of an eye, their screams still echoing in David's mind. He couldn't get their faces out of his head, the terror in their eyes, the hopelessness. They had fought valiantly, but it hadn't mattered. It had never mattered. David collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. How had it come to this? How had they gone from a simple military operation to facing something so far beyond their comprehension? They were soldiers, trained to survive, to fight, to adapt. But this wasn't a battle they could win. It wasn't a war with a clear enemy. It was a nightmare, a twisted, unexplainable horror that had been waiting for them, just beneath the surface. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door broke through his spiraling thoughts. His body went rigid. Who could it be? It was too dangerous to go outside. Too dangerous to leave the barracks. "David?" a voice called from the other side. It was shaky, trembling, but unmistakably familiar. David's heart skipped a beat. "Carl?" The door creaked open, and Carl stumbled in, covered in dirt and blood, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was alive. But how? How had he escaped? David stood up, his hands shaking. "Carl, you're alive! How?" Carl didn't answer at first. He just stood there, panting, his gaze unfocused, as if he hadn't fully processed what had happened. The terror was still raw in his eyes, and David could see the confusion and fear that gripped him. The creature, whatever it was, had taken Harris. It had dragged him away, and yet Carl had somehow escaped. "I don't know how I got out," Carl said, his voice low and strained. I don't know. I was being pulled, David. Pulled into the darkness. It felt like something was dragging me under, like I was drowning in shadows, but then I don't know how, but I broke free." David couldn't believe it. "How did you break free? What happened?" Carl swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he wiped the blood from his face. I don't know. It was like a light, a flash. I saw something, some kind of figure in the distance. I don't know if it was real or if it was just my mind playing tricks, but it pulled me away. I just ran, and somehow I made it back here." David felt a spark of hope flicker in his chest. Could it be? Could they really escape? Had Carl somehow found a way to break free from the creature's grip? But the hope was fleeting. The creature was still out there, waiting for them to make a mistake. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't escape it. Carl looked at him, his face drawn with exhaustion. "David, we can't stay here. We can't keep running either. That thing is coming for us. It's not going to stop until it's finished with all of us." David nodded, his stomach turning. He knew Carl was right. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't just hunting them. It was feeding off their fear. It was toying with them, manipulating them, pushing them closer to the edge of madness. "We need to fight back," David said, his voice firm. "We can't just wait around and die." Carl shook his head. "How?" "We tried to shoot it, David. It didn't do anything. What can we possibly do to fight something like that?" David didn't have an answer. But deep down, something inside him refused to give up. If there was a way to stop the creature, to put an end to this nightmare, he was going to find it. Even if it meant facing the unexplainable, even if it meant walking into the heart of darkness itself. Suddenly, a noise from outside caught their attention. A loud, violent rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The earth seemed to shake underfoot, the distant rumble of something terrible drawing nearer. David's heart clenched. It was here. "They found us," Carl muttered, his voice barely a whisper. David didn't hesitate. "We don't have much time." He grabbed his rifle, his hands now steady. He knew they had no chance against the creature, but they couldn't just sit back and wait to die. They had to move. They had to keep fighting, keep searching for answers. "Get your gear, we're going back to the burial site," David ordered, his voice hard with determination. Carl looked at him, his eyes wide. "You can't be serious. That thing is still there. It's waiting for us." "I know," David said, "but the only way we can stop this is by understanding it. The stone, those symbols, we have to destroy it. We have to break the seal before it's too late." Carl hesitated, fear still gripping him. But he knew David was right. They couldn't run anymore. Not from this. They gathered their gear quickly, preparing for whatever lay ahead. There was no time to waste, no time to second-guess themselves. They were running out of options. The door creaked open as they stepped outside. The sky above them was darkening, thick clouds swirling in an unnatural way, as though they were being drawn toward something evil. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, pushing them forward into the unknown. David's eyes darted around the camp, scanning for any sign of movement. The creatures were getting closer. There was no more hiding. "We need to go now," David said, his voice tight. The two men moved quickly through the trees, the path to the burial site now etched in their memories. The forest was silent again, but it was the kind of silence that was worse than any noise. It was the silence of something waiting, something watching. As they approached the site, the air grew colder, thicker. The earth beneath their feet trembled again, and the ground seemed to shudder in anticipation. The creature was near. They could feel it. David's pulse quickened, his fingers tightening around his rifle. The burial site was just ahead, the twisted remnants of the stone still visible through the darkness. They didn't have much time. David looked at Carl, his gaze steady. "We're not going to make it if we don't do this now." Carl nodded, swallowing his fear. He wasn't sure they could destroy the creature. He wasn't sure they could break the curse. But one thing was certain. They couldn't just keep running. They had to fight back. And as they stepped into the heart of the burial site, they realized that this was it, the final stand. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie crimson light over the forest as David and Carl approached the burial site once more. The ground trembled beneath their boots, and the air felt thick, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on them. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made their hearts race. The creature was near, its presence undeniable, and they could feel it, like a predator lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. "This is it," David muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "This is the only chance we have." Carl nodded, his face pale, eyes darting nervously into the dark corners of the forest. "What do we do if it's not enough? If we can't stop it?" David didn't answer. There were no more words, no more reassurances. He had no idea if destroying the stone would work, but they had to try. The creature, whatever it was, had already killed 2 of their comrades. They had no choice but to face it. As they reached the burial site, the ground seemed to shift beneath them, the soil dark and uneven, as though something long buried had begun to stir once more. The stone was still there, half buried beneath the earth, glowing faintly under the blood-red moon. David's breath caught in his throat. This was the source. This was the key. He could feel the weight of it, the ancient evil that had been sealed in this land, held by the stone and the cursed symbols. It was waiting, and the longer they delayed, the stronger it would grow. David took a deep breath and knelt before the stone, his fingers brushing the cold surface. The symbols that had once seemed so cryptic now felt familiar, as though they were calling to him. A low hum vibrated through the air, like the stone itself was alive, resonating with an energy older than time. He knew what he had to do. The symbols were the seal. If they were destroyed, the curse could be broken. But how? Carl, standing a few feet away, watched David with a mixture of fear and hope. "What are you waiting for?" David's hands hovered over the stone. The knowledge was coming to him now, as if something or someone was guiding him. It was a feeling, an instinct, that he couldn't explain. Slowly, carefully, he began to trace the symbols, his fingers moving over the grooves in the stone. As he did, the air around them grew colder still. A low rumble echoed from beneath their feet, and the earth trembled violently. The creature, it was coming. They didn't have much time. David's heart pounded as he continued to trace the symbols, his fingers trembling with every movement. He could feel the stone vibrating beneath his touch, as if it were awakening. He needed to finish before the creature arrived. Suddenly, a blinding light flashed from the stone, nearly blinding them both. David jerked his hand back, his heart racing as the light seemed to pulse, growing stronger, brighter. No, this can't be right, David muttered, stepping back. Carl's voice quivered in panic. David, what's happening? The light grew intense, the stone itself beginning to crack, splitting down the middle. The rumbling beneath their feet turned into a deafening roar, and the ground around them split wide open, the earth heaving and groaning in protest. The burial site was no longer a safe haven. It had become the epicenter of the creature's power. David looked up at Carl, eyes wide with horror. It's too late, he whispered. But then, as the light reached its peak, a figure appeared before them. It wasn't the creature, not exactly. It was something else, something more human, yet just as terrifying. The figure was tall, its skin pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, those eyes were burning with an unnatural red light, like twin embers glowing from the darkness. Its features were sharp, angular, but its face was hollow, empty, as if it had been drained of life. The figure stood before them, its presence commanding the very air. It was ancient, its aura suffocating, like a spirit bound to the land for eternity. David's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. The soldier, he whispered. The one who died here. The one who caused the curse. The figure didn't move, but its presence was enough. Its gaze turned toward them, and David felt the weight of 1,000 years of suffering bearing down on him. The figure raised a hand, and suddenly, the ground trembled again. A crack appeared in the sky above, a deep, thunderous rumble that echoed through the forest. The creature was not just an entity of darkness. It was a manifestation of vengeance, a manifestation of the curse itself. And now, it was free. The soldier's voice came, not through sound, but through the very air itself. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating in their minds. You have awakened me, the figure said, and now the war must be fought again. David couldn't move. The figure's words echoed in his mind, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. This wasn't just a battle of life and death. This was a battle of history, of souls bound by blood and sacrifice. The curse wasn't just about vengeance. It was about a cycle that could never be broken, a war that would continue for eternity. You cannot stop what you have released, the figure continued, its voice like a whisper that raked at their very souls. This land is mine. It will never rest, and neither will I. David's mind raced. They had to stop this. They had to break the cycle. But how? How could they fight something that wasn't just a creature, but a curse born of bloodshed, war, and suffering? The answer was coming to him. Slowly, painfully, it began to form in his mind, like a whisper he had been ignoring. The stone, David muttered. It's not just a seal, it's the source. The blood from the battle. It bound the souls here, but it also gave power to the curse. If we destroy it, if we destroy the stone. Carl's eyes widened. You think we can stop it by destroying the stone? David nodded grimly. It's the only way. But the figure, no, the spirit, was already moving. It raised its hand again, and with a flick of its wrist, the air around them grew heavy, suffocating. Shadows twisted and writhed, reaching out like hands, grasping for David and Carl. "I will not allow you to destroy what is mine," the spirit growled. David reached for the rifle slung over his shoulder, but he knew it was useless. They needed something more. They needed to destroy the stone, and with it, break the curse forever. "Carl, the stone! We have to destroy the stone now!" Carl, his face pale with fear, nodded. He ran toward the stone, David close behind him. They didn't have much time. The spirit was closing in, its wrath palpable, but they had to try. This was their only chance. With all the strength he had left, David swung his rifle down onto the stone, smashing the symbols one by one. As he did, a terrible screeching sound filled the air. The stone was shattering, and with it, the curse began to unravel. The ground trembled once more, but this time it was different. The earth wasn't trying to crush them, it was releasing them. The creature, the spirit, let out an agonized scream, its form flickering as if it were unraveling, its power fading. For a moment, everything went silent. David stood, breathless, staring at the cracked stone. The moon above had returned to its normal, pale state, and the darkness that had clung to the land seemed to lift, as though it had been freed from a long and terrible reign. But even as the silence stretched on, David knew the battle was far from over. The curse may have been broken, but the land would never be the same again. For a moment, it seemed like the world had held its breath, the cursed land finally releasing its grip on the soldiers. The ground had stopped trembling, the oppressive air had lifted, and the heavy shadows had begun to fade, leaving behind only the pale light of the moon. The stone that had once held the curse was shattered, and the spirit, the ancient soldier who had been bound to this land, had been destroyed. David and Carl stood there, staring at the remnants of the stone, the shards scattered across the ground. The silence was profound, almost peaceful. They could feel the weight lifting from their shoulders, the burden of fear and uncertainty slowly dissipating. But deep down, a gnawing feeling settled in the pit of David's stomach. He knew it wasn't over. Not really. "What now?" Carl asked, his voice hoarse. He looked around at the dark forest, his eyes still wide with terror. "Is it done? Is it really over?" David didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The silence around them was too perfect, too still, and it felt wrong. Something wasn't right. Something was lingering in the air, like an unfinished song, a haunting echo that refused to be silenced. "I don't know," David said finally, his voice strained. "I hope so. But we can't be sure." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled again. This time, the sensation was different. It wasn't the earth splitting open, but a subtle shaking, a low rumble, like the land itself was waking up, still alive with the energy that had been released. Carl turned to David, his face paling. "David, what's happening?" David swallowed hard. I think it's not over. We may have broken the curse, but the land, it's not free. It's still haunted." Before they could react, the first sign of the strange phenomena returned, faint but undeniable. A distant light flickered through the trees, barely visible at first, but growing stronger. It was a soft, pulsating glow, like a beacon in the distance. David and Carl exchanged uneasy glances. That wasn't there before," Carl whispered, his voice trembling with fear. David's eyes narrowed, instinctively reaching for his rifle. The light seemed to grow brighter, but it wasn't natural. It pulsed, flickered, and moved, as if something was guiding it, something that didn't belong in the world they knew. "Stay close," David muttered, and the two men began to move toward the light, their weapons raised, every step careful, every sound magnified in the silence around them. As they got closer, the light flickered again, almost as though it were teasing them, leading them deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, the oppressive feeling returning, heavier this time, like something was pulling them forward. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees becoming denser, their branches tangled, almost like they were reaching for them. The pulsating light continued to move just out of reach, always ahead of them, never allowing them to catch up. "David, this doesn't feel right," Carl said, his voice strained. "It's like we're being drawn into something." David didn't answer, his mind racing. The stone had been shattered, the curse broken. So why was this happening? Why was the land still alive with malevolent energy? Suddenly, a sound, distant, faint, but growing louder. Footsteps, the unmistakable sound of boots moving through the forest, marching in a slow, rhythmic cadence. David's blood ran cold. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a march, a procession. The footsteps grew closer. The air grew colder still, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in mere moments. The rustling of leaves, the creaking of branches, all came to a sudden halt. The only sound now was the relentless march. "Get ready," David whispered, his voice barely audible. They crouched behind a thicket of trees, peering out into the darkness. And that's when they saw them. Figures, the same shadowy forms they had encountered before, the ones that had haunted them, tormented them, were walking toward them, their glowing eyes burning with a red light, like embers in the dark. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, as though they were gliding, floating above the ground, their faces hidden beneath their dark hoods, their bodies clothed in tattered armor. There were dozens of them. David's grip tightened on his rifle. He didn't know if these were the same figures they had seen before, or if they were something else entirely. But one thing was certain. These weren't just spirits. They were soldiers, the ones bound to the land, the ones who had fought and died in the ancient battle, their souls never allowed to rest. But why were they here again? What was drawing them back? As if answering his question, one of the figures stepped forward, its glowing eyes locking on to David. The others followed suit, their eyes fixed on him as though they had known he was there all along. Their faces remained hidden, but their presence was palpable, cold, suffocating, and filled with a hunger that David couldn't fully understand. The figure raised its hand, and the others did the same. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their intentions were clear. "Run!" David shouted, his voice urgent. But before they could even react, the ground beneath their feet began to shift again, this time violently. The trees groaned, their trunks snapping as if the forest itself was fighting against them. Carl turned to run, but David grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Number, we can't outrun them. Not like this." And that's when the sky above them seemed to crack open. A deep, thunderous roar filled the air as a rift. An unnatural tear in the very fabric of the world appeared above them, splitting the heavens wide open. The rift glowed with an ominous red light, casting long, terrifying shadows over the soldiers as they watched in horror. David's mind raced. The battle, the curse, it wasn't over. The land was still bound to the souls of the fallen soldiers. Even though the stone had been destroyed, the curse had not been fully broken. The land itself had become a prison, and the souls of the dead were still trapped here, unable to move on, unable to find peace. The spirits of the fallen were not gone. They had only been released, and now they were free to continue their endless march. But for what? What did they want? What would happen if they reached David and Carl? David turned to Carl, his eyes wide with realization. "We need to destroy the rift. It's the only way to stop this." Carl nodded, his fear giving way to a determined resolve. "Let's do it, David." Together they rushed toward the rift, their hearts pounding with every step, the spirits closing in around them. There was no more running, no more hiding. This was the final stand. The battle for their survival wasn't over. It had only just begun. The rift in the sky continued to widen, splitting the heavens above like an open wound, spilling red light across the forest. The pulsating energy of the rift surged, sending waves of force through the ground beneath their feet. David and Carl, hearts racing, moved quickly toward it, knowing that this was their only chance to stop the nightmare that had been unleashed. They could hear the spirits closing in, their marching boots echoing through the trees, their presence growing stronger with every passing second. The air felt heavier now, charged with an energy they couldn't comprehend. The wind seemed to scream around them, and the earth itself groaned in protest, as though the world was protesting their very existence. David's eyes were fixed on the rift, which now shimmered like a door to another world, its edges crackling with raw energy. This wasn't just a tear in the fabric of reality. It was something ancient, something old enough to have outlasted time itself. "We have to destroy it," David said, his voice tight with urgency. Carl nodded, though his face was pale with fear. "But how? How do we destroy something like this?" David's mind raced. They had seen the rift. They had seen the spirits, the soldiers bound to the land, the ones whose restless souls had never found peace. The rift wasn't just a manifestation of their rage. It was the source of the curse. It was the portal that bound them to this world, keeping them locked in a cycle of violence and death. The answer seemed to come to David in an instant, though it felt both right and terrifying at the same time. The rift was connected to the land, connected to the bloodshed of the battle that had taken place here centuries ago. The spirits, the cursed soldiers, they were bound by blood. And if the blood had caused their binding, then perhaps the blood was the key to their freedom. "We need to use the blood," David said, his voice sharp with realization. "The blood that was spilled in the battle, the one that created the curse. It's still here. It's in the land. It's what keeps them tied to this place. If we can find a way to use it to break the rift, we can end it. We can end the curse." Carl looked confused. "What are you talking about? Blood? How do we—" David didn't have time to explain. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on them. The spirits were closing in. The rift was growing wider, more unstable. If they didn't act now, it would be too late. He turned to the ground beneath them, eyes scanning the earth. There were remnants of the battle all around them, broken rocks, twisted metal, and dirt stained dark with blood. The ground itself was scarred by centuries of suffering. And in that moment, David knew what had to be done. They needed to call upon the blood that had soaked this land, to use it to seal the rift and free the spirits. "Carl, grab the rocks. We need to break the earth open." Carl didn't question him. Without hesitation, he started pulling at the earth, digging with his hands, trying to uncover whatever lay beneath. David joined him, digging through the dirt, his hands raw as he clawed at the earth. It was then that they uncovered it, the dark stone, weathered by time, yet unmistakable. It was the source of the curse, buried deep within the earth. The stone that had held the spirits, the one that had bound the souls to this land. David's heart pounded as he reached for the stone, his fingers brushing against it. The moment his skin touched the cold surface, the rift above them pulsed violently, as though the stone itself had awakened. The ground trembled again, stronger this time, as though the earth was trying to swallow them whole. "David, what do we do?" Carl shouted, his voice filled with panic. What do we do with this thing? David didn't answer right away. He was staring at the stone, his mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together. The blood, the battle, the curse. They had all been connected, and now they had a chance to destroy it once and for all. He turned to Carl, his eyes burning with determination. We need to pour the blood onto it. The blood that was spilled here. It's what connected the spirits to this place. We need to use it to break the bond, to sever the connection between them and the land. Carl looked horrified. You want to use their blood? How do we even do that? David's eyes flickered towards the rift, where the spirits were now clearly visible, marching toward them. They had seen the bloodstains before, on the stone, on the ground, even in the rift itself. The spirits had fed on the blood, and the blood had kept them bound. If they could return it to the stone, they might be able to destroy the curse. Without another word, David began to slice his own palm with the edge of his knife, grimacing as the blood began to flow. Carl hesitated for a moment, but then, seeing the determination in David's eyes, he followed suit, slashing his hand with the same knife. Their blood mixed with the soil, and David pressed his palm onto the stone, pushing the blood into the cracks. He could feel the energy building beneath him, the power surging as the rift above them grew more violent, more unstable. The rift screamed, a deafening, guttural sound that shook the very air around them. The spirits were close now, so close that David could hear their whispers, their angry voices calling out for vengeance, for release. The ground shook beneath them as the stone began to absorb the blood. "Do it now," Carl shouted, his voice frantic. David pushed harder, his fingers digging into the stone, and with all the strength he had left, he pressed his palm against the surface. The rift above them exploded in a burst of blinding light, and for a brief moment, everything went still. The air, the earth, the sky, it all held its breath. Then the light flickered and dimmed. The rift was closing. The spirits, the soldiers, the curse, they were fading. Their figures flickered like shadows, like smoke being blown away by the wind. The oppressive feeling that had filled the forest began to lift, and the ground beneath them seemed to calm. The pulse of energy that had driven them, that had sustained the curse, began to dissipate. David and Carl stood, breathless, their hands covered in blood, watching as the final remnants of the rift flickered and disappeared. The land, once bound in pain and suffering, was finally beginning to heal. The spirits that had haunted it for centuries were no longer trapped, no longer bound to the land. David didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time, he felt hope. A hope that had seemed impossible just moments ago. They had done it. They had broken the curse. But the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence of a land that had been scarred for too long. David looked at Carl. The weight of everything they had, been through, finally sinking in. The land was free, but they had lost so much along the way. The battle had been fought, the curse had been broken, but the cost had been high. As the forest began to settle, the moon above them finally shone through, no longer red, but pale and peaceful, as though it had been freed from the weight of the curse. The spirits, the soldiers, the land, they were at rest, for now the forest was still. The wind had died, and the land, once suffocating under the weight of a curse that had plagued it for centuries, seemed to breathe for the first time in an eternity. The red moon, once a symbol of death and bloodshed, had faded into a pale, peaceful light. The earth no longer trembled beneath their feet, and the oppressive feeling that had once haunted the soldiers was finally gone. David and Carl stood there, the echoes of the battle still ringing in their ears, their hearts still pounding with the aftershocks of everything they had just experienced. They were alive. They had survived. But at what cost? Carl, his face pale and gaunt, took a step back and let out a long breath. "We did it," he whispered, though there was no triumph in his voice. Only the exhaustion of survival, the weight of what they had witnessed. "It's over." David didn't answer right away. His eyes were still fixed on the land before him, his mind spinning with everything that had happened, the spirits, the curse, the rift, and the unimaginable horrors they had faced. It felt surreal, like it hadn't truly happened, like they had stepped into a story only to find themselves at the center of it. But the reality of what they had done was sinking in, and David knew that this wasn't just the end of a nightmare. It was the beginning of something else, something they couldn't fully comprehend yet. "We've broken the curse," David said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "But the land, it's still scarred. It's free, but it's not healed. The blood that was spilled here, the lives lost, they'll never truly be at peace." Carl frowned, looking out at the horizon, where the last traces of the rift had faded into nothingness. "The soldiers, the ones we saw, what happened to them? Are they really gone?" David turned toward him, his expression grim. "I think so. The spirits, the ones that were bound to the land, they've finally been released. They've found peace, I hope. But the land, it's been stained by the violence, by the bloodshed. It's not something that can be undone in a single night." David could still feel the weight of the land beneath his feet, the echoes of the souls who had suffered here, the battle that had been fought, the war that had never ended. He could still feel its presence, though it had been released from the earth. But there was something else, a quiet sense of finality in the air. Carl let out a long sigh, as if the last remnants of his own fear were slipping away. "What do we do now? After everything, we're free, but we're still here. The world's still out there, and I don't know how we fit into it anymore." David's gaze softened as he looked at Carl. He understood what his friend was feeling. They had both been marked by the horrors of this land, and even if the curse had been broken, they were still carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. There was no going back. The men they had been before this battle, before the bloodshed, were gone. "I don't know," David said quietly. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were. But we can keep moving forward. We can try to make sense of what we've seen. We can find our way, piece by piece. Maybe that's all we can do now." Carl nodded, his face hardening, but there was a glint of something new in his eyes, a quiet resolve. "Yeah, maybe you're right. We can't undo any of it, but we survived. And maybe that's enough for now." The two men stood there for a long moment, staring out over the land they had freed. The forest, once filled with the echoes of battle and the cries of the dead, now seemed peaceful. The air was calm, and for the first time since their arrival, the weight of the world didn't feel like it was pressing down on their shoulders. David looked up at the pale moon. It was just a moon now, no longer a symbol of terror. It was simply there, hanging above them, a quiet witness to the end of the curse and the beginning of their uncertain future. "This place, it won't forget what happened here," David murmured. "But we've given it a chance to heal. Maybe that's all we can do." Carl glanced at him, the corner of his mouth lifting into a tired smile. "Yeah, we gave it a chance. Now let's give ourselves one." David nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. They had been through hell, and they had emerged on the other side. The ghosts of the past would always haunt them. There was no escaping that. But they were alive. They were free. And for the first time in a long time, They had a chance to move forward. The two men turned and began to walk back toward the camp, their steps slow but steady. The journey was far from over, but at least they knew now that they could face whatever came next. Together. As the dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the forest, David and Carl continued their quiet walk. The air was cooler now, and the forest, though still marked by the bloodshed that had once filled it, felt like it had started to breathe again. The curse had been broken, the spirits released, and the rift was gone. But as they walked, a small part of David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. What they had done, what they had witnessed, wasn't just some ancient curse. It was a warning, a lesson. And even though they had freed the land from the chains of the past, David knew that the forces they had unleashed were far from fully understood. They reached the edge of the forest, the camp now visible in the distance. It was a quiet morning, the camp abandoned for the most part, but there was still a strange sense of peace lingering in the air. David stopped for a moment, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "Do you think we've really put it all behind us?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. Carl paused beside him, his brow furrowed. "Not really, not everything. Some things, I think, never really leave us. But we can keep moving forward. We can try to make sense of it. The truth, what we saw, it's going to stay with us. We have to live with it. But we don't have to let it control us." David nodded. He understood. The ghosts of the past would always linger, and though the land had been freed, the weight of their experiences, the horrors they had witnessed, would remain with them. But in the end, they had survived. They had broken the cycle. As they continued toward the camp, David glanced back one last time at the forest. The land that had been so dark, so cursed, now seemed calm. The shadows had receded, and the light, soft, gentle, was beginning to shine through. For the first time, the forest felt like it could heal. The story had ended. But in a way, it had only just begun. The land would recover, and David and Carl, though forever changed, would continue their journey, their own personal battles behind them, and their future still uncertain. But the world, David knew, would always have its mysteries. Some would be solved, others left hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to uncover them. As they walked into the future, side by side, David couldn't help but wonder, would the land truly heal? Or would something else arise from the shadows? A new mystery, a new battle, waiting for the next soul brave enough to face it? Whatever came next, David knew one thing for sure. They had faced the darkness, and they had survived. For now, that was enough. Wow, you made it to the end. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this intense journey. We've uncovered some truly chilling secrets, and I hope this story kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the supernatural and the mysteries of the past, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. And hey, if you're new here or you haven't yet, subscribe so you don't miss any of the exciting stories, investigations, and mysteries we uncover together. There's so much more to explore. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the story. What did you think of the curse? Do you believe the land could really be haunted? Drop your comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing from you. Thanks again for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the truth is out. They're waiting to be uncovered.